Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Merci de nous avoir rejoints sur ce canal pour suivre les rencontres économiques 20e du nom, organisées par le Cercle des économistes. Alors, Aix en scène cette année, puisque vous le savez, la Terre a contraint l'organisation à différer quelque peu sur les principes traditionnels. Et nous sommes donc depuis la Maison de la Radio, en direct depuis Paris, non pas Aix en, mais les débats sont tout aussi intéressants. Vous allez pouvoir le constater. Merci donc d'être là pour cette session consacrée à la cible gouvernance sans proximité. Thème d'actualité évidemment au moment où il nous faut construire la reprise après cette pandémie terrible de Covid-19. La crise sonne-t-elle le glas du jacobinisme centralisateur, administration que l'on dit trop parisienne, centralisée de l'État, donc éloignée des réalités du terrain? Faut-il un nouveau système? C'est ce que nous allons voir avec nos invités. Nous sommes ensemble pour un petit peu plus d'une heure. Et, vous toutes et tous qui nous écoutez, nous regardez sur le site internet économiques Aix en Seine et sur le site France Info, eh bien, vous pouvez poser toutes vos questions. Elles nous parviennent ici en direct et nous consacrerons une dernière partie de l'émission à répondre à vos questions. Avant de donner la parole à Françoise BENHAMOU du Cercle des économistes.
Before handing the floor to Françoise BENHAMOU from the Cercle des économistes. Hello. So we have speakers, Carole DELGA with us, and the head of the Occitanie region, Mrs. Yamini from the Center of Political Research in New Delhi, and you worked for the World Bank and the Ford Foundation. Pierre Weiss, who's a professor at the École des Ponts et Chaussées. You were the head of the school, and then you started a research project. We also have Didier, who's the president of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry of Paris, and in the studio with us, Pascal, who's the founding president of Wavestone. So Françoise BENHAMOU, maybe you can tell us about the theme of the session, an impossible governance without proximity. Thank you, Emmanuel, and thank you all. Governance and proximity? The question between both was asked in many fields, whether social life or public life. How to reconcile local and national? Does a national decision, can a national decision be accepted if the local population do not understand it? So there is need for more efficiency, democracy, and we need to reinvent new way of government that do not neglect proximity. What's at stake is the local change, as Pierre Weiss said. But what it implies is, first, to implement a better articulation between the central state and the local collectivities. That is decentralization. Local collectivities want to redefine priorities in terms of public politics, whether for industry, education, health, environment, and so forth. So this is at the core of the recovery plans. And with local players, they confirm the relevance of public policies. So regions have new demands in terms of environment, and they wish for contracts between regions, and that's what Carole DELGA is going to talk about. And we saw how cities could change daily life thanks to local people in charge. So the pandemic shed light on the question. And Jacques Lévy underlines that public policies must understand different relationship to spaces for social and economic processes. So space is like an archipelago denoting several territories. We have to recognize the necessity of a differentiation between public policies and take into account the diversity of localities, which was the case for measures taken at a national level, but which felt not adapted to the local level. And this is what we find in public venues such as the hospital. Who should be in charge of hospital? Doctors, head CEOs, and the imperative was to adapt very quickly to the crisis. So there is a gap between the local players and the decision makers. There was an article in a paper saying that there was a gap between the logics of the healthcare staff and the logic of the government. Then there's also the question of participatory politics. In situation of very strong decentralization, citizens want to participate into the public decision. And it's a tool for efficiency because it increases trust. We saw an illustration with the French experience of the Citizen Convention for the Climate, with 150 citizens taken at random so as to reduce greenhouse gases by 40% within 2030. But this is not a new practice. We can go back to Athens before Christ. But this mode of construction is composed of citizens that take part in democracy more and more. And in 20 states, there were similar experiments carried out so that democracy would be increased, but then the strength of the parliament would decrease. Finally, the companies are not foreign to those questions. Several debates showed that it would be possible to govern differently and to take the employees into account, but also civil society, so that people would be more watchful to the externality produced. Thank you for your outlook on the problem, Mrs. Françoise BENHAMOU. So this session is about impossible governance without proximity. Let me turn to you, Mr. Pierre VELTZ. You're talking to us from video, and you're part of École des Ponts. So in our society, at one point, there was a shift to the local. Could we have the context? You have 7 minutes to speak. I'm very happy to take part in this conference, and I'm talking to you from Provence. In fact, there are 3 different periods that we might characterize as relationship between the local, the national, and maybe the global. So there's a strong interaction and tolerance between the economic institutions and the civil society that wants to take part into the debate. So the first period was that of the rebuilding after the Second World War, where the state decided upon many subjects, trying to rebuild the country, but also an economy with the great groups that emerged at the time. The period is still has influenced us very much because it designed the economic geography as we know it, and it also engendered the technology as we know it, like in Bordeaux, Grenoble. Those cities were used throughout the period with industrial sectors. Then at the beginning of the 80s, things changed because companies invested mostly abroad and the state did not have any lever to use urban planning, saying Renault should go to such city or Citroën to such other city. And it's also a time when decentralization, and that's a major change, that's when decentralization started with the De Fer laws. So gradually but steadily, local collectivities had more power, and they managed to be more skillful in terms of technique, know-how. So the success stories of the last 25 years depend upon local collectivities. Then the question of the territorial development is probably more tricky. But this local development paradigm appeared because people thought redistribution cannot occur only on a national scale, but on a local scale also, through collectivities, elected mayors, cities, regions. And right now, we are gradually pulling out of this system. People tend to speak of neo-localism, and I'd like to talk about that. First, we see that the standard models. I'm sorry, but the sound cuts very frequently, so it's quite difficult for me to translate. So we can see that the models are one privileging proximity, short circuits, circularity, circular economy. I was fortunate enough to be at the head of a jury of competition where local collectivities try to be innovative. So these models are very important for the future. And the last example, maybe a more abstract one, we shifted to a model which is not only one of decentralization, but one of distribution, because we have a network and we have local bodies that want to be as autonomous as possible, sometimes autarcic, which might be a problem, but they work in network with one another. And it's a very different system from what we knew in the past. But all this comes from a fractured society also, because if we only talk between state collectivities, we can see that the civil society, especially the youth, want to participate in the debate. So people talk about the environment, ecology, but there's also probably a global change in values. And those values are the same internationally. I looked at a study on the millennials in the United States, and we have the same thing in Europe. So the values are to make sure autonomy is possible. People want to manage their own life. They want to have a meaningful life across all sectors. And also a willingness to do something, to be active and not simply to be part of a long line of production. We will have to conclude. Yes, yes, I'm about to. So those are somehow concrete communities. So, of course, the central state does not know where to stand in this situation. And the other question is, what about cohesion consistent at a national scale? Okay, thank you. We'll come back to this subject. Thank you, Pierre Weist, for your speech. And we'll come back to you for debate. Now, Carole DELGA, you're the president of the Occitanie region.
So now we will talk about the management of crisis by the region. So you have 4 minutes. I'm sorry, please abide by the agenda. So hello, everybody. Thank you for this invitation. It's true that as the president of a region, as a former I'm sorry, the connection is very choppy, so we're doing our best. There's a need for a new relationship between the national level and the local level. We have to reconcile, and we mustn't be in confrontation, but rather in a logic of accompanying each other with a participative democracy, rather than a representative democracy. But at the level of the Occitanie region, I'm sorry, we've consulted our inhabitants on the name of the region, for example, and the situation with railroads and everything, and we will have a draw next week to implement, as of mid-September, a citizen agreement, because we will be the first region to implement a new deal, a plan to transform and develop the region. And I wanted, for the inauguration of this event, that there is a citizen participation for this. So it will be 100 people from Occitania that will be drawn to be part of this convention, of this agreement. So just to show that we can, for example, making democracy be reborn in a way. And that's why in the recent days we discussed about delaying the regional elections after the presidential elections. And I was opposed to that because there was a concentration in this case of elections. You know, I think it's a mistake to delay these elections. I think we cannot afford to concentrate the power in the hands of the national level. It's a mistake, and it's a misunderstanding of what our citizens are expecting, what our populations are expecting. So more decentralization. So there's a need also to adapt to new approaches and have a participative democracy at different levels. And so then there's the issue of, I'm sorry, very choppy. We have to create a new era of decentralization. It cannot just be a new step. So it's the state that takes care of the national level, but the regions takes care of the proximity. So the crisis showed that, you know, with the problem of the supply of masks, for example, it's the region that massively purchased masks so that we can supply them to the population. There was a shortage for our health care people, but also everybody involved with the relation with the public. And so there's also an interregional level. For the masks, for example, we managed to have the logistic means to get our supplies. For example, in Occitania, we ordered 16 million masks. Occitania has 6 million inhabitants, so 16 million masks versus 6 million inhabitants. So we are also present on the economical stand. We had conferences on a weekly basis with all the representatives, economic players, and with the state, of course, and with the professional federations and with all the stakeholders to be more reactive, more flexible. And it's true that Occitania tries to be as close as possible to the field. And our economy has nothing to do with the economy of the Western Pyrenees. You know, it's different. So we have a flexibility, and my services, economic services, are installed in, are set up in the Chamber of Commerce and Industry offices and for half. That is where we locate our services, and when it's possible. So this enables us to have a one-stop shop, and if I take the question. I'm sorry, choppy connection. Very sorry. So it's. So she's talking about different departments and with the different activities. You know, some areas are more involved in agriculture, others are more of the urban type. So again, we try to be very flexible to be able to adapt to different realities, because the crisis, which will become social, is quite different whether you are in the western part of our region, which is concerned by the drop in the aeronautic crisis, while the east is on the coastal areas is more faced with the issues of the drop in tourist activities. And so what's interesting also is that we have demonstrated that there is a regional political willpower. I'll give you practical examples. The investment funds, while we have enterprises like of the SME type, which are facing difficulties because of the crisis, and there is a need to strengthen their equity capital. So it's a regional investment fund, which is, of course, managed by our services. And I will definitely propose to my neighbors to integrate the same approach. Other topics like 1 minute, I'm sorry. So it's the question of mobility with using hydrogen-powered engines. So today we are giving a lot of thought to create companies to purchase hydrogen-powered trains and buses running on hydrogen, because for small communities they can't afford that. And I think we are entering in a new era, and the Republic of the Territories, and I think we have to be able to bring people together, and the region is the right scale. We work with the metropolis, the departments, and we manage to have a financial capacity and be different to the national level when faced with the needs of our populations and our enterprises, to ensure more equity, more. So thank you very much, Carole DELGA, the president of the Occitania region. You stay with us for the second part of this exchange that will take place in a few seconds, a debate between the different participants. And we're very sorry on the quality of the connection. You know, it's very choppy, as I told you. As you know, the Rencontres Aix-en-Seine are organized by video conference, so this explains sometimes that we have a few problems, but I think we understood your presentation, the most of your presentation. So Didier KLING, he's the president of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry of Paris, Île-de-France. Mr. KLING, here again, we are, you will talk about the weight of the economic operator in this situation, territorial situation. 7 minutes for you, Mr. KLING. Thank you very much. I listened to the previous speaker mentioned the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and I have one question related to the fact that the The title of this session, Impossible Governance Without Proximity, doesn't have a question mark as if it was obvious. Whereas it may be things that are a little more subtle, more complex. Due to the fact that today, with the crisis that we're in, we had the problem of masks, for example, and the question arose on decentralization needs. They need to be more decentralized for the supply of masks. Our citizens found that the state was failing on that, and the local authorities were very active. But my friend Alain Di Crescenzo, the president of the Chamber of Commerce, was faced with that. Is true of the Île-de-France region and some other regions. And we're tempted to say that to ensure a good organization, we need less state and give more responsibility to the local authorities, to the local communities. We also have the examples abroad. Things work better on the management of the sanitary crisis in Germany because it's a federal state, you know, with the landers and everything. The landers managed to be more efficient. And it's true for Germany, but there are other states that have decentralized organizations that maybe were not as efficient as that. Like Italy, for example. In Italy, it's organized in regions, but it wasn't very efficient there. Like the United States or Brazil, which are federal states, I think they do have some concerns in terms of efficiency in those two countries. Anyway, as far as the management of the crisis, yes, the regions, the departments were very active and efficient, but the state was not absent. The state was present, the national state, the representative of the state, the prefect, who had been the director of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, is very competent, very efficient, very active. And in the Île-de-France, we had Michel Cadeau, who has the same qualities and played a precious role. So I would be tempted to raise two questions here, ask two questions. The first, I didn't hear. And the second, are they cases where proximity can be risky? So on the first question I didn't hear, is can you associate good governance with proximity? Okay, citizens ask for proximity. They want proximity. But they feel they're citizens of the world citizens. I was walking around Aix because this weekend I'm in Aix-en-Provence. I was walking around in Aix, and I saw that everybody had their mobile phone, wherever we're on the planet. You know, people. I figured that okay. I saw that there are people, and it's difficult today. This round table, for example, shows that we can be in different areas of the world, locations in the world, and have the same discourse. Whereas we claim at the same time that we belong to a territory. And if we're attached to a territory, and if it's important, I don't understand that a recent law decided that political representatives can no longer accumulate a national office and a local office. So maybe this is incoherent, inconsistent. And the second question is, isn't proximity dangerous for good governance? So we know there are conflicts between rural populations, urban populations, between agriculturists and people who raise oysters. You know, there are eventually conflicts of interests. And the more I'm in the field, you know, I run the risk of having a proximity that can be hindering good solutions. So there's one thing that we use a lot. Efficiency is one expression we use a lot. So what we're looking for is to be more efficient. So efficiency in the interest of the consumers. For example, we talk a lot about strategy, and I think a group to be efficient should be as much as possible, well distributed around the planet. Even though you keep your origins, you know, so on the one hand, you have products that come from all over the planet, and at the same time, we keep some products locally, showing that we are attached to the land where we live, in such a way that if I was to propose a conclusion, it would be twofold. I wondered if enterprises were able to be a good reference. You know, a group, economic group, has the same criteria, same as the organization of a state, for a simple reason. A group that will try to... Sorry? There's a big difference between an economic group and the organization of a state and a nation. And an economic group, director of a subsidiary, okay, I can appreciate his efficiency or her efficiency, but it's more difficult on the at the political level. It's more difficult to assess. And if if the president of the subsidiary, the chairman of the board can, or the director general can eventually terminate the person from its functions. And it's not the same in a political instance where there's the issue of legitimacy. So in the end, what are the needs of enterprises? The need of enterprises is to say, I need to know the consumer. I understand that in this culture, there's a territory. But I know that the Chamber of Commerce of the Île-de-France region covers 8 departments. Each of these departments has its own wealth and diversity. And they have different definitions, but my problem as the head of a corporate head is if today I want to set up my activity in a region, I need to know my counterpart or an interlocutor. It's the public institutions, it's the region. I need to know who is my counterpart. What I need to be efficient is to have a single, one-stop shop. Okay, and if you have multiple people, then it hinders the efficiency. So, thank you, sir. And by chance, he's in X today. So now we will have a short break before we go to Mrs. Yamini AIYAR, who's waiting for us in New Delhi. She's the president of the New Delhi Research Center. So we'll have just a few, we'll try to get a better connection during this break. So a question to Françoise BENHAMOU and Pascal IMBERT is the crisis of COVID-19, has it had this, you know, in major enterprises, we talk about the local approach, but the COVID-19 crisis will demonstrate that the real life, the local life, the everyday life of the collaborators, of the employees, of all the markets, and this is recovering a role, a top role, very important role. And Françoise BENHAMOU, we can give an example, and I'm talking to the economists now, the consumption, we talk about short circuits, circular economy, and we see with what Pascal Imbert just said, this notion of territory is found directly in consumption. No, don't buy in China anymore, buy here, buy locally. We're on a very complex issue. You know, big questioning, big question for economists. Will consumption, will we recover consumption? The households have accumulated 75 billion of savings during the lockdown. And will they spend money? How will they spend money? Either they will buy flat screens or durable goods. They're not produced locally, no, but we are on contradictions with what Mr. KLING was stating yesterday, the relation between the global level, national level, and local level. And there's a real stake on the fact that the recovery must relaunch local economies. Pascal Imbert, it's the end of globalization. Is it the end of globalization? We can say that, we see that globalization as was hit, you know, and the multilateral instances no longer function. And besides that, it's no longer the expectation of the stakeholders. The stakeholders have taken the floor in enterprises, and they say that globalization is not the only solution. You know, there was the phase small is beautiful that has been ruled away by global is beautiful and ruled out, and now local will become beautiful.
Notion.
Françoise BENHAMOU, there's an important notion, which is that of the price, because items that are manufactured abroad at a low cost in China, Asia, and so forth. Now, if we do the same items locally, the consumer will have to pay for more. And nonetheless, they require locally produced goods. Yes, it's a worry for a lot of people who say, I would be willing to, but it's going to be too expensive for me. So maybe we can help, we can support some sectors that endeavor to produce locally and ethically also. That is, products that are not manufactured by children. So we are reaching a moment when people are willing to make some efforts to do without several goods so as to be more ethical and to consume goods in a more modest way. So it means those are budget choices within a family, yes. Pascal, you have a consultancy with your Wavestone company. Now, what about this notion of territory after the COVID-19? And the question of the local, the importance of the local. There's a word which comes back recurringly in companies. It's the raison d'être of the company, which is part of the statutes. What's the meaning of the phrase? Well, la raison d'être is an evolution which consists in saying that the historical model of governance of the companies and what is taken into account is old-fashioned because the governing has not changed for a long time. It's about shareholders and the board of directors, and there were a few stakeholders, that is the employees, and through representation by employees' representatives. So the idea was that the company was here to create value, whatever the outcomes. But the raison d'être is the fact that society and stakeholders appeared because there's an impact of the actions on the company of them. And the meaning of the company must not be only creation of value, but there must be some meaningful trend. Danone is the first French multinational to be listed on the market. And the legal form is to be a company with a mission. So yes, it's part of the same trend to have a raison d'être, to consider stakeholders who are not shareholders, others than shareholders. So it's not about creating value and receiving wealth, but we have to take into account the other players in the company and the benefits that would be other than creating value. And this trend existed well before COVID-19 because PACT was voted earlier on, and it probably was amplified by the crisis. And there's an interesting parallel with what's taking place in our debate and the question of participative democracy. Because the dialogue that the companies are developing are part of the same trend. Okay, I think we have our video speakers back now for those session of Aix en Seine. But 95% of the speakers are connected to us via video conference. So, a technical miracle, we're connected to India. Mrs. AIYAR, I think you can hear us. You're the president of the Center for Policy Research in India, New Delhi. You have 7 minutes to talk about the subject, and I know you have many things to say on the notion of territoriality. We're listening to you.
Thank you for having me. It's an absolute pleasure. I wish we could have been there in person, but these are such other times. I wanted to actually start my remarks by commenting, by adding to the discussion that I heard just before me on this tension between the global and the local in our economic sphere. And I'll talk about the politics as well in a moment. But in fact, in India, we're having a very, very live debate on this. And in some way, the pandemic and our response to the pandemic has sort of further exaggerated this challenge. India is an economy that is very much on a growth path. We have a huge potential to expand our exports and to be a much more visible and valued player within the global value chain. But we also are in an interesting economic moment where across the globe you are seeing a certain degree of a sort of de-globalization to a degree, or a retreat of globalization. And so there's a very important question that India needs to ask itself about whether or not the East Asian model of exporting your way to prosperity is in fact necessarily entirely available to India as a country. But at the same time, there is a challenge of our own, the ability of our local economy to be robust enough to effectively participate in regional open trading blocks. And there is a very, very vibrant debate underway. A lot of our trade policies have in fact tended to increasingly look inward on the argument that we in fact need to strengthen our competitive advantages internally better in order to be able to be effective participants in the global economy. And that is sort of unfolding itself in the Indian debates, I think, in interesting ways. On the other hand, on the one hand, we see participation in the global economy very much crucial for expanding private investment and building local manufacturing. But at the same time, we also are beginning to build a political narrative around strengthening the local economy. And I think the future of India's economic growth path is going to be very much about how we balance out these particular tensions. And I think that the global response to the pandemic really highlights and heightens these tensions that were already in existence in the global debate prior to the pandemic, where we were beginning to see a much more inward focus. The nation state was beginning to re-establish its presence as a sort of response to globalization across the world. And with the pandemic, actually, I think the nation state is really back in focus. This is probably the first time in contemporary history that many countries across the world closed off their borders, even as we were able to interact with each other, technology that in some ways made the physical land borders almost irrelevant in so many ways. And I think the future of this question of global and local is really going to resolve itself in how our economies respond and what technology brings to us as a means of bringing people and economies to interact with each other. I don't think that we know how this is going to unfold at the moment, but I think it's these fault lines that are going to determine the dynamic of global and local in our governance. This I wanted to talk about was much more focused on the experience of India and the relevance of the politics of the local and the relevance of the importance of governance at the local as a response to the bigger challenges of building economies and building public systems that actually work. I think one of the important things to understand about India is that even though we are a federal country, we are units. When we adopt adopted our constitution in 1947, we adopted a constitution that had a fair amount of centralization embedded in its federal architecture. And that was best visible in the fact that the central government, our national government, had far more significant action powers, even as expenditure powers were much more significant at the subnational, provincial, state level. And over the years, as our economy grew and as it opened its centralized planning of the economy started becoming much more irrelevant as state governments began to become important players in competing for building their economy. Which pushed for deeper federalism, more decentralization at the state level. But as this decentralization was taking place and the economy was getting more and more sophisticated, India also began to reintegrate itself into a national market. So the movement of goods and services across the country, the movement of labor across the country, all of which have created an interesting tension that on the one hand, a deeper and more competitive architecture for building local economies at the state level. Our market is now much more integrated at the national level. And we now have a national goods and services tax, which is in fact centralized tax in a way. We have a very, very strong movement of people across the country in search of jobs. So our labor market is also becoming increasingly nationalized, which is creating important questions on how you build institutional systems that can negotiate and coordinate across regions and across borders. I think some of the speakers previous to me were talking about how do you balance the local and the national. And I think India is going through an important experiment precisely in that. So we are, for example, we have a goods and services tax council that brings in various members of the finance ministers at the state government level to negotiate tax rates at the central level. So there is now a rechanging of the role between the center and the state, where the center increasingly being pushed to play a much more coordination role as states build their economies. Of course, politics becomes complicated because politics tends to centralize.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, Madame Yamini AIYAR.
Thank you for your. I'm afraid we have to stop you. Thank you very much. Okay, let's come back to Paris, and we'll keep on going with our meeting. What assessment can you make of what we just mentioned? What is your outlook on what you heard in this last half hour? Oh, yeah. Well, first, I think that it is a fact. The local will progressively come back within the nation, and that's probably a good thing. But I'd like to plea in favor of our national and European governance instances. The planet is too small for us to avoid having agreements and principles that will regulate our common life, the world in which we'll live tomorrow. And as companies and economic players, we are very much influenced in our strategies and the products and services we offer that will be the future of our society. So we're influenced by those principles in terms of tax, but also governance, as we mentioned earlier. And those rules and principles must be defined at a wide scale. I'm quite frightened when I see the way we discredit our national or European instances, whereas the key questions must be addressed at a global scale, such as development or inequalities in development, or tax or economic models. Of course, it's difficult Of course, sometimes we can criticize some choices made, but we have no other alternative than try and improve those governing bodies. Now, people on the stage must show that they want to work for the general interests, and they must be transparent and very clear. And we also want criticism to stop shooting the ambulance, because it's about the quality of the overall work and not intestine wars. And we should so your message to the media was very clear. So critical questions, key questions will be on that level. So of course I'm in favor of the local, but this should allow the European bodies to focus and to give meaning to their actions. Something else I wanted to think about, well, we talked about participatory democracy, and something I'm very sensitive to when I look at our companies and how to be in contact with the new generation that join our society. Those young generations feel quite distant from the traditional institutional mechanisms, which is a risk. So I was talking about the stakeholders earlier on. We talked to a body called the Collective for Environmental Awakening, and those people come from the best selective schools in France, and they say, we won't join your companies if you do not show us that you're aware of the environmental emergency. And we wish to recruit those people, so we talk to them, and they are telling us, you're building our future world. And I think we need such systems in our institutions. We have to integrate stakeholders, and this is what we said earlier on. Citizens must be able to express themselves and to give their standpoints, especially the youth, because we're building new societies, and otherwise the future will be very difficult, and the youth won't will feel excluded from society, which is not what we are aiming at.
So there are direct questions. There are questions are really directly related to what you said, Pascal Hébert, from the internet users. You know, because all the questions can be addressed on our website. So in relation to what you said, Monsieur Hébert, this question or comment, a lot of citizens are under the impression that they have no longer control over their existence because of the technocracy, the red tape. So how can we reconcile efficiency and authentic sovereignty? It's a question from Marianne. After, how can we reconcile Europe with diversity of local territories, and what will be the position of the state with this new question? Do you have a comment to make, Pascal, maybe Françoise BENHAMOU, or any other guest speakers? Want to take the well, Pierre VELTZ, professor at the Ponts et Chaussées Engineering School. Would you wish to react? Yes. Yes. I think that this question, I think it's very cultural, and I'm fully in line with what Monsieur Hébert just said. Somehow, it's a movement that consists in saying the big, the organized, the institutional no longer concerns us, because we no longer trust that level, and we will build and develop our own solutions. and be much more autonomous at the local level. And that's it's a very important change and a shift. And there's a lot of tension, like Monsieur Imbert mentioned, because this model with local communities that operate, they're no longer interested in what's happening at the upper level. And that's a problem. I think we have to manage to reconcile both levels. So there's the populist reaction that needs to be taken into account, where there's a big rejection, and the territorial aspect is very much given a lot of importance to. But there's another thing that consists in saying, I no longer believe in large institutions, large corporations, or Europe. Oh, this is too remote for me. We had an emergency, and we see that the larger institutions cannot respond to the emergency. So we just get organized at a local level, and we have we don't have great ambitions, but we will take care of things at the local level. It's interesting, but it's also a problem. And it's not the former discussion we have between the state and the local communities. No, it's another topic. Thank you, Pierre, for this answer. Yes, Madame DELGA, President of the Western region. Oh, no, Mr. KLING. Yes, okay. So on the question that was raised on sovereignty, I think we have to know what we're talking about here. I understand that if it's a question of the fruit and vegetable supply, I prefer to buy products that come from my territory. I don't need fruit and vegetable that were produced at the other end of the planet somewhere. And but if it's a question of building the Airbus of electrical batteries, then yes. It's not at the local level because I probably do not have the financial support or the capacity. Here, it's Europe that has the proper level to renew the fantastic success of Airbus in aeronautics, for example. So we have to know at what level we place ourselves when we talk about the economic sovereignty. Thank you, Didier KLING. I see Yamini, who's with us in India. Madame AIYAR, will go back to you in a minute, if I may. I will talk to the president first of the region, Occitanie. Do you wish to comment on this? With the microphone, yes, on this aspect. It's interesting to see that in the new generations are attached to the local level, which reminds me of the generation of my great-grandparents or grandparents. But with a view to what Monsieur VELTZ say, in the field, I feel that the youth are interested for the larger causes at the international level. We can combine both topics, but by bringing concrete answers locally, we enable them to have a new trust in themselves, to be self-confident, and then to be able to open up to the international level and be interested in Europe at the European scale. So I think it's not a contradiction. I think we have to respond to this need, this demand for more local services, short circuits, the question of culture, and then at the same time, we can open up on European issues and but it's a good answer. We can combine globalization and relocalization. That can be combined. Thank you for this testimonial, the president of the region. So I turn to New Delhi now, where we have Yamini AIYAR, president of the Political Research Center in New Delhi. Madam, you wanted to comment on this specific angle, maybe by comparing some India, Europe, and thank you.
Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you. Everything's going well. Yes, we can hear you. Yes, we can hear you. Yes, we can hear you.
Je ne sais pas si le traducteur peut éventuellement...
No, I just wanted to say two very
Madame s'exprime.
One important part of this push toward the emergence of a demand for more local coming people is very much about the need to reclaim trust in fundamental principles of democracy democracy and core principles of participation that give you a sense of belonging and an ability to hold your state accountable. And I think that even in the just like in Europe, in the Indian text too, the demand for a sense of belonging and the need to participate in the process of governance is very critical to be able to reclaim the essence of democracy. So we must, I think that at a time when democracy across the world is going through its own moment of transition and in some parts even a crisis, the local is really very, very crucial to reclaim the core value of democracy and to reclaim a sense of belonging between people and the state. And that is something that we should recognize, engage with, and the role of the economy has to integrate its debates on the economy have to integrate themselves with this.
Okay. Thank you very much for this comment, Madam. So another question from an internet user who is quite relevant, I think, on something you raised, Pascal Imbert, earlier. Do you think that the aspirations of the French to escape from the cities, will there be an exodus? Will people want to leave the cities and move to rural areas after the COVID-19? Well, it would be a good thing because but it would entail, probably it would lead to a better balancing of wealth in our territories. Personally speaking, I don't think that will be the case. I don't think people will migrate because urban populations are, by essence, urban. They were locked down for some months, and things were working out well. Some people figured they could be moving to smaller cities to work, but very quickly they realized that when you're an urban dweller, it's difficult to think of leaving the cities or leaving the city. There was a small wave, a small tendency, but I think you would need more than the COVID-19 crisis, and I think it'll take a generation before we strike a new balance. So something interesting that we saw in the news, it's difficult to leave the city because for some urban dwellers, leaving the city for the countryside, you know, there's the rooster, the crows, and you complain about that anyway, animals and whatever. So are we still able to discuss, to exchange, you know, between the rural populations and urban populations? Is Monsieur Pierre VELTZ with us? How about the dialogue between urban and rural populations? Yes, I'm here, yes. There's the French society is divided. It's an archipelago. We're under the impression that the segments of population don't communicate anymore. But of course, when they had the yellow jackets, we heard a lot that there's an urban population, and there are the rural populations, and some that are involved in globalization, others that are left behind. I think it's too simplistic. We can't. That's not how things happen. But it's true that there is a vision today. There's a divide. There is a divide in the perception of the world. But it exists inside urban areas as well as rural areas. And I would like to say that I agree with what Carole said earlier. The new generation is weary of large institutions. It likes the big causes, you know, idealistic positions. But this turning to the local level, we realize that if you want to control things, you have to choose your level and start with a smaller level. But they don't trust larger institutions anymore. So thank you very much for your testimonials. It's time to stop this session. We could have continued this very interesting exchange. We'll do this at other rendezvous. Maybe Françoise BENHAMOU could propose a conclusion. The impossible governance without proximity. A lot of things were said. Yes, it was a very rich discussion. What struck me is the concern for an articulation that we're seeking between the global level, national and local levels. So we heard ideas, propositions. We see to what extent Mrs. DELGA in her region is concerned. Well, this concern is, chopped up. And we don't have the participation level we would like. And we saw the relationship the younger generation have with these questions or the issues. The younger generations feel that they are far from the larger institutional organizations. I think we've pushed a cursor on the side of the local level at the end of the crisis, but I think we'll go back to the institutions and national level. We need it. We still need it. Maybe as of next year when we are back in Aix-en-Provence on this wonderful territory in the south of France. So thank you very much to all of you. Carole DELGA, President of the Occitanie region, Mrs. Yamini AIYAR was here with us from New Delhi in India, who is the President and Chief Executive of the Center for Policy Research. Pierre VELTZ from the ParisTech School. And Didier KLING, also thank you, the President of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry of Paris, Île-de-France, and Pascal, the President, Founder of the West Consulting Office. So thank you very much. We have other sessions that will follow. So you have the program, just choose, take your choices. So thank you very much for your attention. Goodbye.